late 6.5 hours later, a few inches later, day 2, day 3, day 4, a few moments later, 1 eternity later, 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m., 3 weeks later, many months later. So much later, all of her got tired dating and they had to hire anyone. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later. Meanwhile, 8:01 p.m. the next day later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several better pounds later. Meanwhile, 6 hours later that same evening, several days later, 6 months later, 36 weeks later, 1 minute 37 seconds later, 1 later, 1 pair of pants later, 8 hours later, 298 frozen patties later, 3 hours later, epilogue the next day. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later, 3 days later, up in a good night later, 3,000 years later, 1 week later, 7:59 a.m., 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later. The following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, much later, 7 hours later, epilogue. Several song-filled hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, it's 15 minutes later, 7 months later, thousands of years later, 16 parallel field days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day, meanwhile, later, just then, what follows the brief construction montage. Do you hope you enjoyed this construction montage? Meanwhile, back at the lowlands, 1 frozen lesson later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, in the void, approximately 10 hours later, early in the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 11 later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long every line later, 72 hours later, 2 hours later, just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage, the next morning, many takes later, flashback and no flashback. The very next evening, 1 hour later, the next day later, 6 days later, 6 more days later, the next morning, moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later, graduation day, 1 hour later, 5 minutes later, 80,000 impressions later. Won't you please stop it at me? You started with very annoying. 3,000 weapons later. Soon after, 8 minutes later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. Many secret patties later. Minutes later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tractor later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sub story later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. And the next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning later. The next morning later that night. The next day. Late weekend of that morning later. Online time again. You get the idea. 5,000 celebrities later. Meanwhile, one little boost to the surface later. A few minutes later. 1 hour later. 5 billion years later. See you next morning. Later that night. See you next evening. One operation later. 1 in a million, zillion, trillion, quadrillion times later. 1 hour later.